The chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to first thank my colleague, the Minister for the Member of Parliament for Golden Gates, for this elegant folder of papers. I was remarking that we're supposed to be all equal and not some more equal than others. So good. Now I've got mine. I came with a cardboard folder. I want to thank you profusely. Mr. Speaker, before moving the motion this morning, I want to first offer condolences to the family of Clunas Devity, who served as a writer and a journalist, mainly in the days when I was trying to get in this place as a writer at the Nassau Guardian, and passed away all too soon a few weeks ago, was buried on Saturday. I think the newspapers showed some photographs this morning of the service which took place at St. Agnes. But I thought he was one of our finest political writers, and I want to pass on my condolences to his family on his passing. I wish also to offer my congratulations to the Reverend Warren Anderson, who is the 14th pastor of the Mount Carey Union Baptist Church in Fox Hill, which is the oldest church in the Fox Hill Village. In doing so, he succeeds the Reverend Enoch Backford, who served here as chief clerk, who is now Reverend Backford for his service. Mount Carey Baptist Church is 170 years old this year, and during the Fox Hill Festival, at the request of the Prime Minister last year, we expect to give a definitive lecture on the history of Fox Hill, which we hope will be televised nationally, to explain how the Fox Hill Village came to exist and the history of the people of Fox Hill. And I want to thank the new Mount Carey pastor for at least considering the idea, because I'm hoping that they will agree that it takes place there as the oldest place in the village. And so congratulations to Reverend Anderson. Mr. Speaker, this is a privilege for me. I am honored to be able to move this bill for an act to amend the Public Holidays Act to designate Majority Rule Day as a public holiday, and to create the 10th of January in perpetuity as Majority Rule Day and a public holiday. It's been a long time coming, but now the day is finally here, and a dream come true for a man who was a child of 13 in 1967 when the great event happened, and now able to memorialize and immortalize this day in our history. And thinking back to 1967, I would never have imagined that this could have been possible. Our Prime Minister likes to say, until lions have their authors, the tale of the hunt is told by the hunter. A hymn writer said it in a different way. This is my story, this is my song. Normally, a motion of this kind and import would be moved by the Prime Minister, and he's kindly agreed to allow me this signal honor to move the House in this motion today. I trust that we are able to give this bill unanimous support, which has been, as I said, a long time coming. The bill is likely to be succeeded by my honourable friend, the member, by my honourable friend, the Member of Parliament for West End, or for West Grand Bahama. The MP for West Grand Bahama is described by the Right Honourable Member for Centerville as a disciple and apostle of the late Sir Lyndon Pinley. Sir Lyndon is the father of the Bahamas in its modern incarnation. And no doubt, the Member of Parliament for West Grand Bahama will provide his unique experiences in that rare privilege of being a friend, confidant, and protege of the Founding Father. This day, then, should at its end not only succeed in the passing of this bill, it should also be a history lesson from a unique and personal perspective and provide for younger ones a social perspective which is missing from the history books, coming in the mover and the seconder of the motion from people who were there when many of the events unfolded. As I speak today, I wish to pay tribute to those heroines and heroes of the day we now call Black Tuesday, the 48th anniversary of which passed quietly last week on the 27th of April. It was on that day that the last of the historical milestones or markers before the 10th of January 1967 was laid down. And in this connection, I wish to remind the House of the biblical injunction from the book of Joshua. When your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, "What mean these stones?" Then you shall let your children know, that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that we might fear, stand in awe, to revere the Lord your God forever. The question is, what mean these stones? And I go to the biblical injunction because throughout the march toward majority rule, the history of the country is in fact infused by our leaders and their connection to the church, to Christianity, and the Bible. In fact, as I was reviewing this matter this morning, Michael Creighton, in his seminal work, A History of the Bahamas, points out that just before the 1967 general election, he writes, "Besides this, an enterprising Nassau preacher reminded his congregation that it was on the 10th day of the first month that the Israelites were led out of captivity in Egypt. And the PLP voters went to the polls singing the theme song, Exodus, as their anthem." So it infuses the whole struggle. In 1976, I was an employee of the Bahamas Information Services. And from that year onward, I worked, in retrospect, I'm sure it's not literally this, but in retrospect, I worked now, it seems like almost every day with Lyndon Pinley, from sunup to sundown, until about 1983. And it was during that time I was asked by Sir Lyndon to design the formal opening of the PLP's National Convention. This ended up including summaries of the history of the party by a group known as the National Alliance of the Progressive Liberal Party, headed then by Sean McQueenie, and of which I was a member. And the summaries of the history of the struggle were read out each day at the start of the convention. Later, the summaries were published by my friend Paul Drake in a pamphlet form called Great Moments in PLP History, and that pamphlet is now a much larger work, which is now in its 3rd edition, and I tried to provide most members with copies of this at some point, but this is the current edition. The reason I begin there is that this is in part the reason why I'm allowed to perform this service this morning by my party. Over the years, as the Founding Fathers and actors have moved off the scene, I have found myself more and more the repository of much of the social history of how we came to be where we are. And I determined to accept and embrace that role as one of the authors of the history, one of the framers of the legacy of who we are as a people. It is a story which I get to tell often, the older I get. It is a story which I've reduced to a bite-sized snapshot of our modern political history that can be told within 20 minutes. It is my view that history must be packaged in that way to make it interesting and digestible for young people. It should be as exciting as it actually was for those who lived it, with all the colorful characters, the takes of the action, the suspense, and the inevitable victory of 10th of January and the culmination of the struggle on the 10th of July, 1973. I developed a construct which traces the modern political history as a line of events beginning with the Burma Road riots of 1942 and ending with independence in 1973. The idea of the construct was not mine originally. It is actually that of the late Dame Doris Johnson, who wrote a book called The Quiet Revolution. It is she who pieced the story together of how we overcame and made it into this bite size that we can use today. The beginning point then is the Burma Road riots of 1st and 2nd June 1942. The official story of these riots can be obtained from the records of the House. One is the 1943 Commission of Inquiry report called into what they call the disturbances, commissioned by the then Governor David Windsor. The other is the Select Committee report of the House of Assembly headed by Stafford Sands. The Commission report is more dispassionate, and although it goes out of its way to discount race as a factor in the riots, it gave a comprehensive review about the social dislocations at the time and the underlying causes of the riot. Ultimately, the riots led to many social reforms, including the secret ballot and expanded labor legislation. The Select Committee report, as I said, the Select Committee was headed and authored by Stafford Sands, who was later described by the historian Michael Creighton as the leader of Bay Street, the oligarchy of merchants that ran the Bahamas during most of the front half of the 20th century. It is in that report that we get this Select Committee report, that we get the first glimpse of a man called Milo Bowden Butler, who later became the country's first Bahamian Governor General, and who became Governor General deliberately so, because there was an Englishman who held over for a month or so, but deliberately so, he became the Governor General on the 1st of August, 1973, which was the day which marked the emancipation of the slaves. The Select Committee described Mr. Butler, as he then was, as a most unsatisfactory witness who refused to answer their questions and who told the committee that he would answer their questions anywhere but at the committee. And in fact, the little story is told is that, they had two competing leaders of the day. One was L.W. Young, the other was Milo Butler. And when the riot took place, the establishment of the day sent Mr. Young down to try and quiet the fellas down, and they ran Mr. Young. And then Milo came, and he was able to quiet the riot down. So Milo Butler begins to emerge as the most prominent of a small group of black members of Parliament who were seeking to depose the oligarchy that ruled the country, known as the Bay Street Boys. In paying tribute to those men of African descent who were able to get elected in the early 20th and 19th century, one has to mention the names of Milo Butler, L.W. Young, Bert Cambridge, Claudius Walker, Stephen Dillett, Thaddeus Toote, A.F. Adderley, Rufus Ingram, William Parliament Adderley, and Cyril Bowen. The list is not exhaustive, but the fact is they were not a unified force because there was no political party, or there were no political parties in the Bahamas. The country was run on a constitution that was made up of a series of letters patent dating back to 1729, which established the House of Assembly. Later, a letter patent established an upper house called the Legislative Council. The governor, an appointed British civil servant, had executive authority through another such letter, and various local officials governed with him on the Executive Council. Up to the early half of the 20th century, there had only been 2 black people on the Executive Council in its entire history, one of whom was A.F. Adderley, the father of the late Paul Adderley. When the Constitution changed in 1963, the Executive Council became the Cabinet. The Legislative Council became the Senate, and appointments to LegCo, which were lifetime appointments, these were converted in the new Senate to 10-year appointments. So looking at the Bahamas and its struggles toward majority rule in 1967, one has to look back to the riots, but farther back to the 1st of August, 1834, when slavery was abolished in the Bahamas. That freed the masses of the African majority in the country to pursue the electoral franchise. It was an uphill battle because the franchise was then limited to men over 21 years of age with a property qualification. With the African majority being unpropertied and unschooled in the art of political action and organization, few men of color, as they were then known, ended up being elected in the House of Assembly. That began to change after the Burma Road riots of 1942. H.M. Taylor, who later founded the Progressive Liberal Party, reports that the first general election that he witnessed was the general election in 1910. He was living in his birthplace, Long Island. And he recalls that elections were roving in those days, held on different days in different parts of the country. The candidates descended on the island. There was open bribing of voters because there was no secret ballot. Following the elections, the candidates disappeared until 7 years went by and they descended on the island again. The secret ballot was used for the first time with the election of Milo Butler during the by-election to the House in 1938. Used universally in New Providence for the first time in 1949 and throughout the country in 1956. The next social milestone or marker is that of the formation of the Citizens Committee in 1950. This committee was formed to reverse the ban by the authorities of the day to prevent the showing of No Way Out, the first film with Sidney Poitier, which was considered racially inflammatory. They were successful, and it included men on the committee like Dr. Cleveland Eneas and Maxwell Thompson. But it did not morph into a political party. But soon came the Progressive Liberal Party in October of 1953, which will mark 60 years as a party this year. Milo Butler joined the PLP and ran as a candidate in 1956. The party won 6 seats. The early MHAs, as they were known, were as the Magnificent Six, were Samuel Isaacs, Randolph Fox, Lyndon Pindling, Milo Butler, Cyril Stevenson, and Clarence Bain. Later, the United Bahamian Party was formed in 1958, and they were made up of the Bay Street merchant group that had been running the country for most of the 20th century. There was a general strike in 1958, led by Sir Clifford Darling. And this led to the expansion of the number of seats in the House of Assembly, which came about as a result of pressure from the British government following the strike. There were by-elections held in 1960. That's when A.D. Hanna was elected to office for the first time. The legislature passed a law the next year which allowed women to vote after the fight by Mrs. Ingram, whose granddaughter is here today in the House, Mary Ingram. Her granddaughter is here in the House and the Member of Parliament for Sea Breeze. The general election of 1962, which led to the defeat of the PLP, with the PLP winning the popular vote with 32,299 votes, and the UBP with winning the general election with 26,826 votes. The number of seats in New Providence where the bulk of the people lived were outnumbered by the seats in the out islands where the minority of the voters lived. The showdown over this issue came on the 27th of April, 1967, when Sir Lyndon threw the mace out of the window, out of the window, and led the people in a demonstration to the Southern Recreation Grounds. And I often say about that event, Mr. Speaker, that Sir Lyndon says that he remembered, and his colleagues, when they were planning Black Tuesday, remembered the Burma Road riots of 1942. They were boys at the time in Western Junior School, when the school was closed because of the riots. And it was said that someone, through a Coca-Cola bottle, broke the window and the riots started. So when they were planning Black Tuesday, they were very careful that that would not repeat itself, that there would not be any riot arising out of Black Tuesday. I happened to meet John Bailey, who was the magistrate who read the Riot Act on Black Tuesday. And he was telling me that on that day, he ended up being the magistrate reading the Riot Act because all the black magistrates packed up and left and went home early. And he was the only one in the office. So when the police came and said, well, it's you have to read the Riot Act. And he went out and did so and then disappeared quickly afterwards. But of course it wasn't necessary because the people were led off the scene to the Southern Recreation Ground. In between 1962 and 1967, the Constitution changed. There was electoral reform. There were no longer multi-member constituencies, no property or company vote. There was a Boundaries Commission which delineated the boundaries according to a formulation which still obtains today. The general election of '67 was therefore fought on the basis of universal adult suffrage for the first time in the Bahamas. That meant that all people of full age then, 21 or above, whether male or female, could vote in the Bahamas without any requirement for property qualification, and the majority expressed its will on the 10th of January, 1967. It was an unbelievably joyous day. I've left out, up to now, the subtext to much of this, which is what some would call the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I introduced it not through my own analysis, but borrowing heavily from the historians, Michael Creighton, who wrote A History of the Bahamas, which I spoke about earlier, History of the Bahamas, and Colin Hughes, who wrote the former partner of McKinney, Bancroft and Hughes, who wrote Race and Politics in the Bahamas. The two works, I think, fairly characterize what we know to be the position in our country with regard to race, and that is, in our politics, it has been throughout the 20th century the major cleavage in our politics. It dominated the debates and choices, and indeed the PLP became associated with the African majority in the country, and the UBP with the European minority. I use the nomenclature African deliberately because when I was born, and if you go today, to go and get my birth certificate today from the registry in the Bahamas, you will find on my birth certificate a legend which describes my race. There are 3 letters assigned to each of the groups in the Bahamas. E is for European, A for African, and M for mixed. And my birth certificate says A for African. So race was a part of the earliest designation of every man, woman, and child born in this country in a certain age, of a certain age. The age in which we lived, into which I had been born and into which I grew up, was infused, therefore, with the struggle for racial justice for the African dispossessed majority. There is no escaping from that historical fact. We continue to struggle today with the negative fallout from a history of racial oppression, from the economic consequences of slavery, and the negatives associated with all that is African. Even conservatives like Etienne Dupuche were involved in this struggle. When he led the historic resolution in the House of Assembly to decry racial discrimination in public places, which resolution was opposed by the ruling Bay Street group, but which was nevertheless passed by this Honourable House in 1956. Colin Hughes's work is instructive on the issue of race and how it dominated the politics of the country. And he had no doubt that this was the backdrop to the changes which took place in 1967. In fact, the dominant factor in the general election, and I would add, in the liberation of the country's politics. That is why 10th January 1967 could then be described by the Right Honourable Member for Centreville as perhaps the single greatest day in our history since the emancipation of the slaves in 1834. If we accept this as such a day, then for these two reasons we must mark this day. Memorialize it and make it one of the milestones so that when the next generation comes along and says, what does this stone mean? The answer is pellucidly clear. You have only to look at the cabinet before 1967 and then look at the cabinet after 1967. Look at the phenotypes and you will see the stark difference right before you. So one aspect then of majority rule is that the African majority in the country won governance of the Bahamas for the first time. But the second and more encompassing and compelling reason is this, that the will of the majority was freely expressed for the first time in that result of 1967. And it was the expression of a free and fair vote with universal adult suffrage. Others have called to say, in their view, that the second is more compelling than the first. But in my view, both are compelling, and I would only say that both are important, and add that it is both stories we have to tell. The Right Honourable Member explained it in his statement to the House on this matter some weeks ago by saying, 10th of January 1967 freed not only the African majority, but also freed the white minority. It is for these reasons that we bring this bill today. And we salute the men and women who fought so hard to bring about majority rule, and it is in tribute to them that we create this holiday. We pay tribute to the late Sir Randall Fox and Sir Alvin Brennan, who heard the call loud and clear and sealed the people's victory. May I turn now to the regime which the bill employs to accomplish what we seek to do. There are three ways that a holiday can be created in this country. One way is by being part of a list of holidays that are appended to the Public Holidays Act. The other is by passing a specially dedicated act. The other is by order of the Governor General. The Governor General may declare any particular day a holiday. This last method is employed when, for example, there is a hurricane coming and the government wishes to close the town down. Last year, the town was closed for 2 days on one such occasion. The route that is being employed in this case is that of amending the list of holidays so that the 10th of January becomes an annual holiday, and in that regard joins the following as annual holidays: New Year's Day, Good Friday, Easter Monday, Whit Monday, Labor Day, Independence Day, Emancipation Day, Discovery Day, Christmas Day, and Boxing Day. That, by my count, is 10. There is, in addition to every Sunday, there is, of course, in addition, every Sunday is also a holiday. So in addition to these annual holidays, every Sunday is also a holiday. Some people in the business community have opined in letters to the government that this additional holiday is going to cost them too much money, that it is an expense which is too much to bear, and that one of the existing holidays should be removed and replace this day. In this present climate, I would wish one of them or their representatives to have the temerity to open their mouths to suggest the removal of one of the religious holidays. The fact is that Discovery Day, which has already been replaced by law of this Parliament with National Heroes Day as the second Monday in October, that's already been done. The only holidays left, therefore, are the religious holidays, unless you want to trouble Labor Day, Independence Day, and Emancipation Day. Which one of those would they have us remove? Would the business community want us to remove Christmas Day instead of the 10th of January, 1967? Mr. Speaker, I would only say this. The importance of this day in the history of our country speaks for itself. The arguments I've heard on this remind me of those in the United States who did not want Martin Luther King's birthday to be marked as a birthday, as a holiday. Indeed, future generations of Bahamians may decide that the heroes and heroines of their times or some previous time must be so honored, and that'll be up to them. I do not find the arguments of the business community compelling, and I am unsympathetic. I would advise them to reach deep into their patriotism, stiffen their spines, and support this legislation. I appeal to them to act for Queen and country in this matter. Which leads me on to the question, what do these stones mean? By passing this legislation, I hope that this House embraces the message of majority rule, that all men and women are created equal, and despite our differences, must be treated with dignity and respect. We remember in aid of this injunction, the injunction of Martin Luther King Jr., it is the content of our character, not our skin color, our orientation, our gender, our nationality, our social status, our creed, which determines how we are treated. But it is the content of our character. That is the first message of majority rule. In this, we still have, as Robert Frost says, miles to go before we sleep. We teach the history of our country, and we leave these stones behind. These milestones behind, like the statues on Easter Island or the rocks at Stonehenge, to let those who come behind know that we were here and the values for which we stood. I spent my entire public life fighting to create a liberal democracy, one that embraces the most virulent racists on the one hand and the most dedicated civil libertarians on the other. I love the vigor of debate and the cut and thrust of what Sir Arthur Folkes calls the untidiness of politics. And I don't get concerned or offended by ideas of a rigid decorum being breached. I came up in an activist tradition, and I identify with activists. I worked hard to create a country where orthodoxy is challenged and challengeable. So I understand the passions of students and demonstrators, and I identify with them. In our philosophy, which built the people's movement, we said Bahamians would come first. We built this nation when others who enjoy its benefits revolted against the very thing they now enjoy. For example, it is so ironic that the Tribune, that is the implacable foe of the government, for which the government can do nothing right except disappear and apologize on our knees, is a rich and wealthy and powerful organization today because of a single decision of our predecessors not to allow the sale of the Tribune to foreigners. They kicked and screamed then. Today, they're still kicking and screaming, but they are richer than Croesus. And the PLP did that by saying, Bahamians first. The majority rule movement brought independence to our country and all the institutions and wealth which we enjoy today. The ordinary man and woman fought and demonstrated in the streets, so today Darrell Miller can demonstrate in the streets and call for equality of Bahamians in the gambling laws. That's what majority rule generation did for us. And we forget how we're in this mix-up on gambling because the UBP decided, Mr. Speaker, to put a law in place to trying to satisfy moral objections that Bahamians should not gamble. So how then, Mr. Speaker, today, could anyone open their mouths and suggest that the people's movement would be against the cry of Bahamians for equality in that regard? How can they do that? How? To base their comments on a draft bill not formally decided by the government, yet everyone and their brothers had their say. Having their say, but, Mr. Speaker, having their say is what majority rule is all about. Have your say. It's a country where we can hear from the people and we govern with the consent of the governed. Not by might, not by power, but by the consent of the governed. The majority rule generation, Mr. Speaker, threw the mace out of the window. That's what they did. And challenged the orthodoxy of their day so that men and women of African descent, all men and women of all colors and creeds, could hold their heads up high as men and women and have jobs and the dignity of labor. That's what the majority rule generation did for us. So, when we say Bahamians first today, they passed the baton on to us. When we say that in our immigration policies that Bahamians must get the first call on the resources of the country, we know the arguments. That's why we're teaching the history. We teach the history so our young people, the generation behind us, will not get scared and not recognize the old ways when they see them. As soon as you see them, you could spot them. We're not saying to dominate your life over them. But when you see it coming, you know, my daddy told me about that. My mother told me about that. Michael recalls in the history of the Bahamas that one of the first things, Michael Creighton, recalls in the history of the Bahamas, that one of the first things that Lyndon Pindling had to do as premier was to reassure the international investment community, right after he won, that the sky was not going to fall in because black Bahamians had taken over the government. That's right. The number of people who were frightened. They were going to leave the Bahamas. They were going to take all their capital because suddenly, you know, these people who had just come out of the jungle were going to take over the country. And he had to, the very first thing he had to do was to reassure the country, all will be well, and exactly. And he ushered in, Mr. Speaker, a period of unrivaled prosperity in this country. Over 25 years of governing this country. So, when the younger ones see this, remember these are the same people 40 years ago who were opposing Pindling and wanted us to apologize. All we are saying is we're standing up for the principles of the square deal. When he said, look up and move on. You know, there was a whole campaign at the time because some people got the impression that because we had taken over, you didn't have to work anymore. So there was a campaign throughout all of the hotels, led by the new administration, to say, you have an even greater responsibility now to work hard, to make this thing work. As Margaret Thatcher said, this is no time, Mr. Speaker, to go wobbly. We must stand firm in the face of what Lyndon called the relentless winds. I pay tribute, sir, to our stalwart counselors. You know, someone from a public platform called them geriatrics. But these are the ones who helped to get us elected. During the time, Mr. Speaker, we were in opposition. These same seniors, who some people revile today, who did not have to depend, now remember, they're independent because they're retired, so they didn't have to depend on income from any employer. So they had plenty of time and energy to work. And they stood with us. They fought for us to get reelected. They were from Pindling's generation, the majority rule generation that fought the orthodoxy of their day, and they did not want a return of a country to return right back to where they started. So, in addition to their own manpower and woman power, they lent us their children and their grandchildren to fight for our reelection. Now today, having done so, we owe them big time. And, you know, I pledge to them that I would not forget. And there's a woman up in Grand Bahama. Her name is Betty Sweeting. Called her name plenty times. And she, over the last months, same Betty Sweeting, very slight lady, afro, single-handedly organized a revolt in Grand Bahama on these immigration issues, organizing the stalwart counselors, and helping to bring about substantial change in the labor market in Grand Bahama. Ask the Member of Parliament, the Minister for Grand Bahama. She reminds me so much, Mr. Speaker, of Ena Hepburn and Effie Walks, and Charlene Marshall, and Charlene Curry, and Artemis Isaacs, and Tammy Ferguson, and Calvin Brown. Whatever wind blows, they are for us. These are fearless people who fight for us, and so we cannot abandon our principles because the same people who opposed us 40 years ago are still calling us ignorant and ugly and no good because we're fighting for our people. Not going to happen.
No.
And if you don't believe me, Mr. Speaker, that things have not changed so much, who was surprised like I was yesterday by these words written by a writer in the Nassau Guardian 2 days ago, and I'm quoting, in the Nassau Guardian 2 days ago, and I quote, "In an age when most people consider dark skin color and kinky hair to be unattractive," this is how the article starts, "In an age when most people consider dark skin color and kinky hair to be unattractive, two women are doing their part to ensure that young Bahamian brown girls develop a healthy view of themselves, to celebrate their respective shades of brown and build their self-esteem." End of quote. That was 2 days ago, Mr. Speaker. 2 days ago. And there is now a club called the Pretty Brown Girl Club, led by Anita Bain and Yolanda Darville. And I say hats off to them, ladies. Hats off. Hats off. But this is now today. My point is, Mr. Speaker, we have miles to go before we sleep.
Yes.
There is still work to do.
Yeah.
So, the reason we do today, what we do today is to launch the next phase of our mission. that of economic empowerment. We must empower our people. I pledged when I was running for re-election last time that given my age and the life expectancy at birth of males in my generation, which is just about 68 years of age, there are certain things which are on my must-do list. This bill is one of them. This bill is one of them. The other is economic empowerment. And I have three people who, in my political life, have befriended me who are business people, one in Exuma, another in Abaco, another in Bimini, and I won't call their names. And in making the case to me in various ways, they've said that if we empower them, they will be able to take care of many other Bahamians, to be able to support our party when it comes out of power. And I told them I am with them, and I will use every legitimate means in my power as quickly as I can, every ounce of my lobbying skills, to make sure the government, of which I am a part, says yes to these young entrepreneurs. Whether it's Crown land, to help at the bank for licensing, we must start to empower our people. I'm looking around and I say, here I am, by fortune, providence, sitting in the seat of Loftus Roca and Arthur Hannah. Sitting in the seat, me. And like my old godfather used to say, Levi Gibson, I don't give a tinker's damn what is said about this or that. We must go full speed ahead to support our people. I ask myself, Mr. Speaker, why isn't my classmate Sandy Sands running Bahama? Why? Why isn't Russell Miller, that's Alvin Miller's son, one of the best trained hoteliers in the country, why isn't he running Atlantis? Why isn't Vincent Vanderpool running Atlantis? Well, what? Well, what's the reason? They're Bahamian. They're Bahamian. You're trying to tell me in this day and age, when we've been in tourism for hundreds of years, we cannot find one Bahamian to be in charge of a hotel in this country? Not one? Always talking about they're not ready yet. You know, need to find some, but you got to train. No, nonsense. Nonsense. And I look around and say, you have a young entrepreneur like Sebastian, and they have huge amounts of capital in their own country, and their own country will not allow them a legitimate opportunity to invest their monies to grow their wealth. And this is a new generation of Bahamians. And we have to fix that, Mr. Speaker. We can't let this go on. I saw a comment about the financial services sector, so-called, being next on immigration's list. Why would people allow such foolishness to be published, which simply is self-inflicted injury? Why do you do this? First of all, my initial statement as minister when I spoke about immigration was there is a special carve-out position for financial services. Well, Stockdinius said, want to hide something from us, put it in writing. But I said to the Member of Parliament for Elizabeth, who's the trade minister, I don't understand these leaders and lobbyists for the business community. I gave him the story of Vernon Jordan and Barry Franklin. Mr. Jordan is a Democrat and opposed to the Republicans. But during the Bush era, did you ever hear him trashing the U.S. president, who was a Republican? Did you ever hear it? He has to do it. He has a job to do for his client, which is to get results, not engage in a public harangue with the government. In all my experience with Barry Farrington, and I'm sure, I don't think he's PLP, but I never heard him engage in any public harangue against the government. And he worked for Atlantis, Paradise Island, all of them. and got along with every government that came along. All you could see him was shaking hands with the Prime Minister and smiling. Never a public harangue. And I'm sure both gentlemen had their public views. How does a public harangue help to get the job done for your client? Tell me that. How you figure engaging in a public war with the government is going to help you get your job done? That make any sense? So, I ask all who've been rowing in the press. I asked Byron Glidden, for example, saying that investors are going to be scared about coming to the Bahamas, which is not true. First of all, how is that going to help your business to spread the kind of false message that the Bahamas is not a place to do business? How that helps you? You're breaking down the house. It doesn't make sense to me. So, I'm done. This is May Day. Perhaps then it's fitting to say the struggle continues. And as our old friend John McCartney used to say in the Vanguard, dare to struggle, dare to win. And so, Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House. I hope it gets the support of the House for all the reasons that I've outlined. God bless the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and you all. Yes, sir.